I care not how humble your bookshelf may be, or how lowly the room which it adorns. Close the door of that room behind you, shut off with it all the cares of the outer world, plunge back into the soothing company of the great dead, and then you are through the magic portal into that fair land whether worry or vexation can follow you no more. You have left all of that is vulgar and all that is sordid behind you. There stand your noble, silent comrades, waiting in their ranks. Pass your eye down their files, choose your man, and then you have but to hold up your hand to him, and away you go together into dreamland. Surely there would be something eerie about a line of books, were it not the familiarity that deadened our senses of it. Each is a mummified soul, embalmed in cerecloth and natron of leather and printer's ink. Each cover of a true book enfolds the concentrated essence of a man. The personalities of the writers have faded into the thinnest shadows as their bodies into impalpable dust. Yet here are their very spirits at your command. One of my favorite things about doing these requests is that they make me look at certain works I might not have considered beforehand. There's a huge body of obscure or semi-obscure art that you might feel you're the only fan of, media that, while not lost per se, has slipped out of the larger pop culture consciousness, if it was ever there to begin with. What I find interesting about today's subject is not just that I hadn't heard of it before this request was made, it's that I hadn't heard of it despite its author being in the top 5 most influential creative figures in modern Western pop culture. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is up there with Walt Disney and Gene Roddenberry in terms of impact on entertainment media. The effect Sherlock Holmes had, both in the genre of mystery fiction and the early developments of geek culture, are enormous. Everything mystery related springs at least somewhat from Sherlock Holmes, from Agatha Christie to Scooby-Doo to NCIS. Doyle really tapped into how to make finding clues fun, how much the personality of the detective is just as important as the mystery itself, if not more so. Sherlock Holmes holds the Guinness World Record for the most portrayed movie character, with extremely successful film and television adaptations being released over a century after the character's conception. In turn, Sherlock Holmes produced one of the first recognizably modern fandoms, complete with a lot of fan fiction and bitching that the creators aren't making their beloved stories exactly how they want them. Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes are inseparable in the minds of the reading public, but Doyle himself was largely ambivalent about his creation. Sure, becoming a household name and one of the highest paid authors of his time definitely had its perk, but this detective stuff wasn't his real passion. No, what he really loved was European history, especially military history, and he wanted to write both historical fiction and actual history books on the subject. The Napoleonic Wars was a favorite subject of his. In 1907, Doyle wrote a rather charming memoir called Through the Magic Door, where he walked the reader through his personal book collection, pointing out and discussing his favorites. He includes a bit about his extensive collections of texts on Napoleon. Now you see that whole roll of books which takes you at one sweep nearly across the shelf? I am rather proud of those, for they are my collection of Napoleonic military memoirs. There is a story told of an illiterate millionaire who gave a wholesale dealer an order for a copy of all books in any language treating of any aspect of Napoleon's career. He thought it would fill a case in his library. He was somewhat taken aback, however, when in a few weeks he received a message from the dealer that he had got 40,000 volumes and awaited instructions as to whether he should send them one as an installment or wait for the complete set. The figures may not be exact, but at least they bring home the impossibility of exhausting the subject, and the danger of losing oneself for years in a huge labyrinth of reading, which may end up leaving no very definitive impression upon your mind. But one might, perhaps, take a corner of it, as I have done here in the military memoirs, and there one might hope for some finality. December 1893 saw the publication of The Final Problem, which introduced the most famous of Sherlock Holmes' foes, Professor James Moriarty, whom Sherlock dubbed the Napoleon of Crime. The story concluded with Sherlock and Moriarty facing off on the top of a waterfall, and both falling to their deaths. Sherlock Holmes was dead, and Arthur Conan Doyle could focus on all the stuff he wanted to write. Oh, don't get him wrong, he knew how popular his pulpy, character-driven stuff was. And so, December 1894, a year after the death of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle introduced us to Brigadier Gerard. An officer in the French army during the Napoleonic campaigns, Gerard got himself involved in a lot of exciting adventures, carrying out various missions for the war effort. The life of Gerard is full of battles, duels, captures, escapes, disguises, secret documents, and lots of pretty young women for Gerard to woo. Or at least, that's what Gerard said happened. The framing device for these stories is that they're being told by a now elderly Gerard, recounting his youthful days being Napoleon's right-hand man. And as such, there's reason to suspect that maybe he's embellishing things a little. When he says he fought off 12 men single-handedly, he probably only fought off 4. When he says he faced certain death with a brave silence, he probably whimpered, just a little, barely audible. He's certainly overselling his accomplishments, or perhaps not quite remembering them right with age, but the end result are tales of wartime bravery that are almost too exciting to be true. Not that Gerard presents himself as completely infallible, though he might not recognize that he's doing so. The main joke for the majority of these stories is that Gerard goes on these dangerous missions and performs brave acts in the name of Napoleon, but he always seems to lack some critical detail, an important clue of what he's actually supposed to be accomplishing. In the first Gerard story, How the Brigadier Won His Medal, Gerard is given the task of delivering a top-secret message across enemy lines. He rushes, fights, and sneaks his way through multiple waves of Russian and Prussian troops, gets to his destination, delivers the message, and returns to Napoleon, expecting to be highly commended. Problem. Either he failed to grasp this, or Napoleon didn't communicate his intentions well enough. It's hard to tell with an unreliable narrator. But the actual plan was for Gerard to be captured. The message was actually false information meant to confuse the enemy. Gerard, in all his bravery, actually hampered the war effort. This lack of context extends to a clash between French and British culture, teasing at the customs of both. Doyle was Scottish, for the record. One of the more popular Gerard stories, How the Brigadier Slew the Fox, involves Gerard on a reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines, and ending up roped into a fox hunt, the procedures of which he does not understand. Not that I blame him. I've never understood the weird rituals of fox hunting. Gerard's bravado and everything results in him riding up to the fox and killing it himself, which is what you totally do not do in a fox hunt, resulting in the other participants getting seriously mad. Gerard assumes they're mad because he beat them at their own game, but we know better. I mean, we as in clueless Americans 116 years later with access to Google. On that, some notes of reading these Gerard stories in the modern day. Originally, stories like this were published in magazines and not compiled in any kind of book form until years later. Some of the most famous books of the 19th century, like Oliver Twist, Three Musketeers, War and Peace, were originally serialized and published in installments over the span of years. In many ways, literature in that time period had a model similar to television today, and owning the final novel version of these stories was the equivalent of owning a season of television on DVD. And in kind, reading all the Brigadier Gerard stories at once is the literary equivalent of binge-watching a show, something I don't especially enjoy doing. Shows are not typically paced to be viewed in huge 6-hour chunks. They don't flow like a movie. They are designed for people to take breaks between installments. It's all stop and go. Reading 19 Gerard stories in a few quick sittings does kind of betray the format, as many of these stories fall into a few repetitive narratives. Get a mission, do some stupidly brave stuff, miss some critical context, never learn your lesson. That's a perfectly solid format, but it gets less interesting when you've read the same kind of story 6 times in the last 3 hours, because it wasn't designed to be read that way. Back in the day, you had to wait months, sometimes years, before you got another Gerard story, which allows his funny, over-the-top adventures to seem fresh every time. That might just be me, though. I do tend to burn out on this kind of thing pretty quickly. It's certainly a more modern concern. Really, the Brigadier Gerard stories are a lot of fun, and I think the key element to that is that Gerard is actually narratively heroic and personally likable. Yes, he is prideful to a fault, he's almost certainly exaggerating his accomplishments, and even in his old age seems blissfully unaware of how all of his adventures broke down. But he still did that stuff. He still charged enemy lines and pulled off impossible missions. Even if you assume he did it by the skin of his teeth, rather than totally dominating the situation, he still pulled this stuff off. Unless he's just completely lying about his military career. Unless none of this happened in any iteration. But at that point, well, does it make any difference? It's a fiction either way, be it Doyle's fiction or Gerard's fiction, so why not enjoy it on its own terms? And when you do that, you can't help but like the guy. At least, I hope people like the guy. I couldn't really find anything conclusive as to how well received these stories were. I don't know how well they sold. What I do know is that Doyle ended up facing a decade of public outcry about the death of Sherlock Holmes, and it was eventually pressured into resurrecting the character in 1903, revealing that Sherlock had actually faked his death and was back to solve more crimes. Again, I don't know everything that happened behind the scenes, but as someone in a creative field who found success on one project and not so much success with any other project, there's a likely narrative here that I highly empathize with. Imagine you create this thing that's really popular, but you're not that in love with it, and you decide to wrap it up with a pretty definitive ending so that you can focus on the stuff you really want to do. But the audience doesn't want that stuff. They want the popular thing. They want you to bend over backwards to retcon your own ending and bring that thing back. Screw your historical fiction. We want Sherlock Holmes. I can't imagine anything more frustrating and disheartening. Sherlock Holmes eclipsed everything Doyle ever wrote, to the point where a giant geek like me never even heard of Brigadier Gerard until a viewer requested for this material to be reviewed. I don't want to say Brigadier Gerard left no cultural impact. These stories were a direct inspiration for George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman series, which are more well known today, though just going from the one book I've read, I'm not nearly as big a fan of Flashman. The protagonist is a lot less likable than Doyle's Gerard. There was one Brigadier Gerard film released in 1970, which came and went without much impact. The original stories aren't hard to find, thanks in part that they're now public domain, but despite the prestige of the author, they just aren't a part of popular culture. There's no public interest in this material. Perhaps it's not the most uplifting thing to take away from all of this, but it is sobering and humanizing. We artists, we creators, we want to be noticed, we want to be successful, and the actual likelihood of that is so small that one of the most influential entertainment writers of his time, the creator of one of the most recognizable and lasting characters in all of fiction, that guy ultimately, culturally flopped with 90% of his output. The stuff he wanted to make was not the stuff people wanted to read, and it certainly wasn't the stuff people remembered. Success is such a rare thing, and that doesn't stop being true even after you've found it. Just because people like this one thing you did is no guarantee that they'll love this other thing you did. You're always going uphill. The Brigadier Gerard stories are fun. Not especially deep, but fun. The main character's charismatic, they don't take long to read, and you can find them all for free. And if you decide to read them, think about the guy who really wanted to write them, who really wanted people to read and love this kind of stuff as much as he did. Because frankly, that's much more real than just the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes.